It's being canceled. In 2012, I had an excess of $190,000 in medical bills. I paid the total out of pocket besides my premiums.
And John, I'm going to apologize and have to leave it there only because the House of Representatives is coming in right now, and we'll take you to the House.
The House will be in order. The Chair lays before the House a communication from the Speaker.
The Speaker's Rooms, Washington, D.C., November 19, 2013. I hereby appoint the Honorable George Holding to act as Speaker pro tempore on this day. Signed, John A. Boehner, Speaker of the House of Representatives.
Pursuant to the order of the House of January 3, 2013, the Chair will now recognize members from lists submitted by the majority and minority leaders for morning hour debate. The Chair will alternate recognition between the parties, with each party limited to 1 hour and each member other than the majority and minority leaders and the minority whip limited to 5 minutes, but in no event shall debate continue beyond 11:50 a.m. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, we're now 7 weeks into the implementation of Obamacare. We know that in the first 4 weeks, 106,000 Americans placed health plans in their shopping baskets, although it's not clear how many of them actually purchased plans. But meanwhile, it's now estimated that some 5.5 million Americans have lost the health insurance that they had, that they liked, and that they were promised that they could keep. The inconvenient truth is that this law has dramatically increased the ranks of the uninsured. Yesterday came word that college students are seeing their low-cost student plans canceled, with replacement costs as much as 1,800% higher under Obamacare. Although the President recently assured the nation that the cancellations were confined to the individual market, we're now learning that his administration gives a mid-range estimate that 2/3 of the small employer plans and 45% of the large employer plans face cancellation as well. Some estimates are as high as 93 million Americans who have employer-sponsored plans will lose their plans next year. And these reports don't account for the millions more who are seeing massive rate increases in their current plans. Nor do they account for the millions more who've had their hours cut back to part-time, or have had their wages cut back, or have lost their jobs altogether as employers struggle to stay in business while bearing these staggering costs. Nor do they account for those who discover that by accepting Obamacare plans, they're losing their doctors. Walmart now warns that the financial impact of this law on families could materially depress holiday shopping. Mr. Speaker, we're watching nothing less than the wholesale destruction and collapse of the American health care system, which for all of its flaws was still the most advanced, accessible, adaptable, and responsive health care system that the world has ever known. And if you doubt that for a second, ask yourself where the world's elites came when they needed first-class medical care. It wasn't to Canada or England or Mexico, it was to the United States. And now we are losing that. There was nothing unforeseen about this fiasco. Republicans have been warning of these outcomes from the very beginning. When we warned that Americans would not be able to keep their health care plans, we were called extremists. When we warned that Obamacare would result in massive cost increases on consumers, we were called alarmists. When we warned that many Americans would lose their jobs or have their hours cut back or see salary cuts, we were called racists. When we asked for a 1-year delay in this program to address these issues, we were called demagogues, arsonists, and jihadists. But now all of these warnings are coming to pass, and still the Democrats persist on imposing this law on an unwilling nation. In doing so, great violence is being done to our Constitution. In implementing this takeover of 1/6 of the American economy, the President has repeatedly asserted what can only be described as a doctrine of executive nullification, the authority to ignore the parts of the law that he finds inconvenient or embarrassing, and to pick and choose who must obey the law and who need not. He's granted some 1,600 exemptions for politically well-connected interests, mainly labor unions. He's excused big businesses from the requirement that they provide health care to their employees while forcing employees to fend for themselves. He's excused members of Congress and their staffs from paying the full cost of Obamacare policies. And last Thursday, he announced that health insurers can ignore the law that requires them to cancel existing policies. Now, notice he didn't say that he was going to seek to change the law. He said he would ignore the law for a year, and he invited health insurers to do the same in direct violation of the principal constitutional responsibility of the presidency to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. Mr. Speaker, I appeal to my Democratic colleagues to consider the damage that this law is doing, both to the American health care system and to the rule of law itself, and above all, to the families who are struggling to deal with its effects. I ask them to heed the growing pleas of the American people to have their health plans restored to them. I ask them to join Republicans in repealing Obamacare and to help us replace it with the patient-centered health care system that we have long proposed, reforms that preserve the best of American health care while repairing its flaws. I yield back.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Hoyer, for 5 minutes. Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, we have 10 days left in this session, this year's session, according to the schedule. We're supposed to adjourn on December 13th, somewhat ironically Friday the 13th. And yet, Mr. Speaker, we see time is running out, and we're not addressing the critical issue and the critical responsibility of funding the government, of applying resources to our priorities. Time is running out, Mr. Speaker, for budget conferees to send us legislation so we can avoid another government shutdown in January. A budget conference agreement will require compromise from both sides, a step that Budget Chairman Paul Ryan and many of his colleagues seem unprepared to take. Mr. Speaker, it has been my premise that the reason we did not go to conference for the last 7 months, notwithstanding the fact that the Senate passed a budget and the House passed a budget, is that Chairman Ryan knows there is no compromise that he could reach, that he could bring back and have the support of his colleagues on the Republican side, Mr. Speaker. And as a result, we have no compromise. As a result, we have no product to consider. This is an extremely disappointing position, Mr. Speaker, because it's clear that the Ryan budget is not a viable blueprint for governing. It was not when we passed it, and it is not now. It was a pretense of fiscal responsibility without any of the substance of fiscal reality or courage. That fact was made evident this summer as Republicans could only pass funding bills for defense and veterans programs, pulling their transportation funding bill and not even bringing the other appropriation bills to the floor. Just a few days ago, actually yesterday, all 12 of the subcommittee, Republican subcommittee chairs of the Appropriation Committee sent a letter to Paul Ryan, Chris Van Hollen, Patty Murray, Senator Murray, and Senator Sessions, and said, we need to have a budget. We need to have a compromise agreement. And we need to have a sequester number eliminated and a rational number replacing it, a number that can work for America. In fact, they said if you don't do it, we're going to have a meat axe. Their verbiage, not mine, Mr. Speaker, a meat axe not only on the domestic side of the budget, education, health care, environment, law enforcement, but also on the national security side of the budget. We all know how the budget really achieves balance. That was offered by Mr. Ryan, severe cuts in the same vein as the irrational sequester that target the most vulnerable Americans and place our economic recovery in jeopardy. Somewhat ironic that on the front page of the Washington Post today we see where Mr. Ryan is not focused on the budget, he's focused on the poor. That is a proper focus, and this Congress ought to be focused on that. But it is interesting that the Ryan budget does exactly the opposite of what we need to do to make sure that the poor are reduced in number and the middle class are expanded in number. That's why, in my view, Mr. Speaker, regarding this budget, so many of his own party could not support appropriation bills within the framework of the Ryan budget. That's why the bills were not brought to the floor. Already, some Republicans are admitting that only a balanced approach will enable us to achieve the level of deficit reduction we need. And contrary to Mr. Ryan's view, this means that revenues, that hated word, revenues, must be on the table. Representative Tom Cole, the former chairman of the Republican Campaign Committee of Oklahoma, is one of them, telling reporters on October 25th that, and I quote Mr. Cole, "I think both sides would like to deal with the sequester, and we're willing to put more revenue on the table to do that." Mr. Cole was one of the signers of that letter to which I referred, saying, let's replace the meat axe represented by the sequester. Unfortunately, Chairman Ryan continues to rule out any talk of revenues, which are the key to any meaningful compromise that will replace the sequester. Now, Mr. Speaker, as you probably know, and as I think my Republican colleagues know, I have said now, and I've said in the past, we must also deal with entitlements. We need a balanced plan, not an unbalanced plan. But without a balanced plan, the sequester will remain in place and will hurt America. Instead of just saying what he is against, it's time for Mr. Ryan and Republicans to show a readiness to compromise to achieve results for the American people. Mr. Ryan is the chairman of the conference committee, yet he has to this date not put on the table what chairmen always do, the chairman's mark or chairman's suggestion or chairman's proposal. Democrats have been clear that we are willing to compromise and are ready to do what it takes to achieve a balanced and bipartisan deal on the budget. This was evident when we voted unanimously alongside 87 Republicans to end the government shutdown, even when it meant supporting a CR at a level, continuing resolution, an appropriation bill for government, at a level we believed was too low. But we understood compromise was necessary, and so we voted. All of us, all 198 Democrats voted to open up the government and to pay America's bills, while 147 Republicans, approximately 62% of the Republicans, voted to keep government shut down and to not pay America's bills. I was encouraged to read the letter sent yesterday, as I said, by Chairman Rogers and the Appropriations Subcommittee chairs, making clear how important it is for conferees to send us a budget by Thanksgiving. By Thanksgiving. That would be this Friday, because we're not going to be here next week, rather than risk another painful government shutdown and the continuation of the irrational sequester this coming year. Many Republicans now agree with Democrats that the sequester is unworkable. Who said so? Mr. Ryan says he doesn't like the sequester. Mr. Cantor, the majority leader, says he doesn't like the sequester. And Hal Rogers has said it is unworkable and inadvisable. The budget conference has a larger mission than simply to rearrange the sequester's severe cuts. This is an opportunity to replace the sequester with a sensible approach that permits Congress to look strategically at our budget priorities and our long-term fiscal and economic goals. If we do so, in my view, it will be the most important stimulus of our economy, job-creating action that this Congress could take. Mr. Speaker, I hope that Chairman Ryan will set his flawed budget aside and instead embrace the approach that many of his Republican colleagues are already recognizing is the only realistic path toward a compromise by this committee. To do so could usher in an historic agreement to achieve real fiscal responsibility for America for years to come. I hope Mr. Ryan's leadership will result in that objective. And I yield back the balance of my time.
The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Thompson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in 1947, Major Bill Hendricks, with the support of his Los Angeles Marine Corps Reserve Unit, collected and distributed 5,000 toys to needy children. Since the program's adoption nationally as Toys for Tots in 1948, the U.S. Marine Corps Reserve Toys for Tots program has collected and distributed close to 500 million toys. On Monday, I had the honor of attending the Center County Toys for Tots kickoff breakfast in central Pennsylvania. Chaired by Gene Weller, retired Marine Major, 2013 marks the 27th Center County Toys for Tots campaign organized by the Nittany Leathernecks Detachment 302. About 250 collection points around Center County will accept new unwrapped toys, books, and games for infants to teenagers until December 15th. This program has grown with the support of area food banks, fire departments, businesses, and hundreds of local volunteers. Mr. Speaker, over the past 10 years, Marines have distributed an annual average of 15 million toys per year, bringing joy to an average of more than 6.3 million less fortunate children each year. We thank you in more ways than one every day, Marines, and I thank you for supporting these children in need. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Blumenauer, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, in an area of violence in the Middle East, tragedy in Syria, and turmoil in Egypt, there's some encouraging news surrounding Iran. The most important signal may have been the election of Hassan Rouhani, who is by no means a moderate by anyone's stretch of the imagination, except in the context of Iran. He was the choice of the Iranian people for change, a different path to reduce the collision course with the United States and the crippling sanctions we've imposed. His foreign minister, Mohammad Zarif, is an able and experienced diplomat with strong relationships with the people who've dealt with him for years, both in the United States and Iran. I'm encouraged by the reports in the news and the opinion pages which point out something I've long argued on the floor of this House, the convergence of interests between the United States and Iran. People forget the key role the United States played in the emergence of the modern state of Iran, the constitutional revolution beginning in 1905, where American influence was profoundly felt. Unfortunately, for the last 60 years, we have serially mismanaged our relationship with Iran. How would we have felt if a foreign power worked to overthrow our democratically elected government and install a dictator? That's exactly what the United States and Great Britain did in 1953 and how the Shah returned to power. It's amazing that the majority of Iranians still have positive feelings towards the United States, which they do. People forget the alignment of interests between the United States and Iran after 9/11 that led them to help us deal with post-Taliban Afghanistan. And when in the capitals of some of our supposed allies in the Middle East, people were cheering at that tragedy, on 9/11 people in Tehran were standing in solidarity with Americans. This, of course, before George Bush recklessly included them in his infamous axis of evil pronouncement. The Iranian people are distinct from Arabs, proud of their Persian heritage, stretching back thousands of years. Iran is an important part of any ultimate solution, stabilizing Iraq and resolving the Syrian conflict. Yes, they have advanced nuclear development, and we rightly should be deeply concerned with their pursuit of nuclear weapons. That's why one of the Obama administration's greatest foreign policy triumphs has been to marshal support of the world for the stringent, comprehensive regime of sanctions. It's made a huge difference, driving down the value of their currency, depleting their foreign reserves, and creating extreme inflationary pressures on their economy. Now is the time to see if a solution can be developed. It's decidedly not the time to ratchet up sanctions even further. Nothing would undercut the more moderate forces in Iran, and more pressure could be very counterproductive because we're at risk of sanctions fatigue by our partners. Other countries that do not share our same policy positions and deep hostility towards the Iranians have gone along with sanctions. To expect that countries like China, India, and Russia are going to follow us with even more extreme sanctions and turn our back on the progress is questionable at best. At worst, it would end up losing support for the sanctions regime we have now, strengthen the hand of the hardliners who do hate America, and set back long-term prospects for peace, not just for Iran, but Syria, Iraq, and throughout the Middle East. Most experts I've encountered feel Iran could have built a nuclear bomb years ago, but they didn't. Recently, they've slowed the pace of their nuclear activities and been open to proposals unthinkable a year ago. The rush to undercut the process is short-sighted, counterproductive, and risks accelerating the development of Iranian nuclear weapons. Now is the time to accelerate diplomacy, not walk away. It's decidedly not the time for the United States Congress to throw a monkey wrench in the diplomatic procedures and ratchet up sanctions. We can always reimpose sanctions, but may not be able to recreate this diplomatic opportunity.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Holding, for 5 minutes.
Seek unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to honor a great American, George Turner from Wilmington, North Carolina, for his recent induction into the Wake County Boys and Girls Club Hall of Fame. George is a man of character and conviction who exudes principle and selflessness. He's a tireless worker and leader in his community. George's success in business is equally matched by his giving nature. Earlier this month, George was honored for his years of service to the Wake County Boys and Girls Club and inducted into their Hall of Fame. Over 700 people came to the Raleigh Convention Center to see George be honored for his service to the Boys and Girls Club. This is a testament to how many lives he has touched in his decades of work with the organization. As a longtime board member of the Wake County Boys and Girls Club, previously leading the organization as board president, George is a great role model to kids across North Carolina. George attended East Carolina University and served in the United States Coast Guard, active in reserves from 1960 to 1968. And before he retired, George was CEO of Ready Mix Concrete Company in my hometown, Raleigh, North Carolina. George is a real leader and in business and in education, serving on the board of directors of the Raleigh Chamber of Commerce, the National Ready Mixed Concrete Association, North Carolina State University Engineering School, North Carolina State University School of Design, and the Raleigh YMCA. George is a truly giving man, and I can think of no one more deserving of the Hall of Fame than him. I congratulate him on receiving this award and thank him for his unwavering dedication to his community. It's a spirit and an enterprise like George Turner that will rebuild our nation and rebuild our economy. Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Maffei, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I am proud to represent Central New York, home of the 6 nations of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. This is also known as the Iroquois, and it includes the Mohawks, the Oneidas, the Senecas, the Cayugas, and later the Tuscarora. It spreads across New York and was one of the earliest civil governments in territory that now lies within the United States and Canada. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of the Oneidas leader, Ray Halbritter's efforts to change the name of the Washington, D.C. National Football League team. The name of the Washington football team is derogatory to the Native Americans of this country. For many Native Americans across the land, the name of the Washington football team is a deeply personal reminder of a legacy of racism and generations of pain. The current campaign to change the team's name is supported by many groups and individuals, including Native American organizations, civic and government leaders, editorial boards, and many leaders, including my colleagues Representative Betty McCollum and Tom Cole, and many others in a nonpartisan effort. President Obama said recently, if I were the owner of a team and I knew that there was a name of the team, even if it had a storied history that was offending a sizable group of people, I'd think about changing it. I wholeheartedly join this effort. I also believe the owner of the Washington team and other NFL owners should meet with the Oneidas as they have requested. How can we achieve mutual understanding unless they are willing to meet? Mr. Speaker, in my office and with me now, I keep a replica of a belt, a two-row wampum belt called the Guzwanta. It was lent to me by the Onondagas, and it symbolizes one of the first treaties between the Native Americans and the Europeans, concluded in 1613 between the Dutch and the Haudenosaunee. The two rows of wampum, which are beads made out of shells, represent Europeans and Native Americans, and they're equal in size and travel together along a strip of white, representing peace. It was and still is a symbol of friendship and community. Although the years since this treaty was concluded have seen much devastation and tribulation for Native Americans, today the Haudenosaunee endure and maintain their culture. Now, we have much to do to improve our relationship between our two peoples after centuries of strife, conflict, and repression. But so many are working to mend the rifts and restore the promise of brotherhood and respect that this treaty belt contains. I joined a group of canoers last summer, Native Americans, European Americans, Asian and African Americans, who rowed together across upstate New York and to New York City to commemorate this 400-year-old agreement. Wouldn't it be great if, in order to show reverence and respect for the Haudenosaunee and the Native Americans tribe across this country, that we continue to do these things? And wouldn't it be great if in this 400th anniversary of this groundbreaking treaty, we could right the wrong and change this NFL's team's name? Mr. Speaker, this treaty was perhaps the first, but it wasn't the last. In November of 1794, George Washington, whose portrait is one of only two portraits in this hallowed hall, through his official representative, Tom Pickering, George Washington concluded the Treaty of Canandaigua with the Haudenosaunee. President Washington had a 6-foot-long treaty belt fashioned to ratify this treaty, that our two peoples should live in peace and friendship. Mr. Speaker, George Washington himself respected the Native Americans of this country and their culture. Shouldn't the NFL team that bears his name do the same? I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Jones, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. Again, I'm on the floor today to talk about the ongoing discussion between the United States and Afghanistan regarding a 10-year bilateral strategic agreement to allow troops to remain overseas beyond the year 2014. Multiple news organizations have reported that talks on the agreement have stalled because of the unwillingness of the Afghan government to let American military search Afghan homes. Two senior Afghan officials went so far to tell the New York Times that the negotiations had reached a profound impasse. Mr. Speaker, I would like to submit for the record a letter that I have written to the President of the United States regarding this issue. Mr. Speaker, this agreement will force the United States to continue paying trillions of tax dollars to support Afghan's President Karzai, a corrupt government which we cannot afford any longer. As it is, taxpayers in the United States are paying $10.45 million every hour for the cost of the war in Afghanistan since 2001. Let me repeat that. Taxpayers in the United States are paying $10.45 million every hour for the cost of the war in Afghanistan since 2001. This is unacceptable, especially at a time when this national debt is an astounding $17 trillion and we have been forced to make deep budget cuts in the United States. Just this past weekend, tornadoes in Illinois killed 6 people. Last year, we watched the devastation on the East Coast that resulted from Hurricane Sandy. These national disasters represent only one area in which we could use the money that we're sending to Afghanistan to help the American people right here. In addition, the bilateral strategic agreement will expose our troops to considerable dangers and risk the loss of additional American lives, all without the approval of Congress. At the very least, we in Congress should vote whether we agree with this agreement or not. It is not required by the Constitution. But we who oversee the spending of the taxpayers' money should demand that the leadership of the House in both parties have a vote, if nothing more than a resolution, that we do support this bilateral strategic agreement or we do not support it. And, Mr. Speaker, I am here today again with my poster that is just such a sad commentary on Afghanistan. It's the cartoon of little Mr. Karzai drawing money out of a money machine that's being paid for by the taxpayers, by the way. And his comment is, "I'm just making a quick withdrawal." Sadly, too, behind him is an American soldier whose thoughts are this: "I would like to make a quick withdrawal from here." I would close by saying, Mr. Speaker, it is time for this Congress to wake up and take care of America's problems and not Afghanistan's problems. A 10-year agreement is unacceptable, and we need to come together in a bipartisan way and send a message to the administration: we do not support this agreement, and we come together, Republicans and Democrats. I close by asking God to please continue to bless our men and women in uniform, and ask God to please continue to bless America, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Matheson, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to bring awareness to our country's rate of pancreatic cancer and the need for strong and continued medical research of this disease. This year, over 45,000 are expected to be diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, a number that has steadily climbed over the past decade. While survival rates for many other forms of cancer have improved in recent years, only 6% of patients diagnosed with pancreatic cancer will live more than 5 years. And that's a statistic that has not improved in over 40 years. Earlier this year, I sat down with several of my constituents affected by pancreatic cancer. One in particular, Jamie, saw her father diagnosed with the disease and then tragically die just 11 weeks after he was diagnosed. Sadly, this story is all too common when discussing pancreatic cancer. I would guess that we all know someone who has died from this disease. Sequestration cut $1.5 billion for the National Institute of Health earlier this year. This is critical funding that would have been used to conduct research on deadly diseases such as pancreatic cancer. Everyone I talk to in my district agrees with the idea that funding medical and disease research is a good thing. We must continue research in this area and begin the process of reversing these remarkably depressing statistics with pancreatic cancer. We owe it to Jamie and thousands of other families affected by this disease to work towards a cure. I'll yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Olson, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today with great pride to share an amazing story of a police officer from Texas 22. At 3:30 a.m. on October 26, this officer from Stafford, Texas, noticed a car sitting at a green light with its left turn signal on. A few minutes later, this Stafford officer stopped that car. As the officer approached the car, shots rang out. The officer was hit in the neck, in face, and in the chest. The thugs sped off. The thugs had no idea who they shot. If they knew, they would have dropped their weapons and surrendered without a fight. They shot a wife, a mother of 2 young children, a former Marine who was the first female to join the Marine Corps' boxing team. They shot Stafford police officer Ann Carizales. They messed with the wrong Marine. Despite being wounded, Ann returned fire, blowing out the back glass of the thug's automobile. She jumped in her cruiser and joined the chase. And she quickly got on the radio saying, "Shots fired, shots fired, I've been hit." For 7 minutes, Ann chased the shooters. The video of her dashboard camera shows how cool and in control Ann was. She chased the thugs through 2 counties, with multiple law enforcement agencies joining the chase. Stafford Police Department, Missouri City Police Department, Sugarland Police Department, Houston Police Department, Sheriff's deputies from Fort Bend County and Harris County, and the Texas Department of Public Safety, all joining in the chase. Despite her wounds, Ann stayed on the radio, kept everyone aware of her location, telling everyone all the streets that she was passing while she was chasing the thugs. Ann was in charge, and everyone knew that. Ann followed those thugs into an apartment complex, and knowing the danger to arriving officers in an apartment complex and the danger to innocent Americans lose their lives from stray gunshots in those apartments, Ann continued to manage the scene. On Ann's dashboard camera, you can see Ann's fellow officers trying to take care of her wounds. Ann can be heard saying, "Get out, it's not safe," and "Tell them to watch your back." Ann's shooter was caught later that day, and his two buddies were caught a few days later. I talked to Ann a week after she was shot. I had two questions for Ann. First question, what did you think when you were shot? She told me that her mama bear instincts kicked in. Those punks tried to take her from her husband and her two kids. They were going to pay for that. I also asked Ann, did you ever think you were going to die? And she snapped, "No, sir. My chief did not give me permission to die that night." Thank you, Ann, for wearing that badge and for your heroism. Semper Fi, Ann. Semper Fi. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Tonko, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I ask for unanimous consent to speak for 5 minutes. That revise and extend.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This week, it was reported that House Republicans are looking for a legislative plan to close out the year and to move forward into 2014. And as such, passed out a blank sheet of paper as their agenda. A blank sheet. Each month, polls put congressional approval rates at new lows, and more independent organizations rank the 113th Congress as one of the least, if not the least, productive of all time. In response, leadership of the People's House has continued to govern by sound bites and pass messaging bills that simply go nowhere, even painfully shutting down the government for more than 2 weeks in the process. If House leadership is looking for an agenda, they need only to look across the aisle to their friends. We have some suggestions, and chief among them is putting Americans back to work. During our August work period, I participated in some 166 events, meeting with constituents each and every time. At nearly every stop, my friends and neighbors wanted to know what was being done in Washington to help the private sector create jobs. My district is extraordinary, but not in this regard. I have to believe that the people of Albany and Schenectady and Saratoga, New York, my hometown of Amsterdam, New York, in the 20th Congressional District, are thinking what America is thinking. They're asking what myself and our colleagues on both sides of the aisle are doing to grow the economy. House Democrats stand ready to work with Republicans to address the real challenges that face this great nation of ours. Sequestration-related cuts are estimated to cost our economy some 1.6 million jobs through 2014. Let's work together to save jobs and pass a budget that invests by growing in a justified way, in a fair way, revenues and belt-tightening so that we cut as we can, so that we then invest as we must. Our family farms deserve the certainty that a 5-year reauthorization of the Farm Bill has brought them for decades upon decades. Our parties clearly don't see eye to eye on cutting such items as hunger assistance for millions of veterans, millions of frail people, millions of elderly, millions of children. Well, if we work together on jobs, we'll help the private sector put people into jobs and cut poverty and reduce the need for hunger programs. Now, isn't that a humane approach? We see middle-class America experiencing pain at the gas pump, and we worry that our foreign policy is dictated by our dangerous dependency, our gluttonous thirst for fossil-based fuels. Yet we stand today without a clear and definitive clean energy agenda that would make our nation a safer place and create tens of thousands of jobs in the short term, boosting an American green-collar economy. It can be done. A report just last week on solar panels was interesting. If we would use just simply 5% of available rooftops in Los Angeles County, we would be able to create 29,000 jobs in that effort. In the past week, we've seen major severe weather events wreak havoc on the Philippines and across 12 states within the Midwest of our country. Even if you choose to ignore fact-based science that really proves climate change to be real and here, we can all agree that our aging infrastructure needs our assistance. It needs to be upgraded. It needs to be improved and replaced so that we're taking a proactive approach to soundness of infrastructure which grows jobs. Instead, we're allowing storms of the century to impact our communities and then have a reactive process that simply isn't the best way to do business. I could go on, but I only have 5 minutes here. Immigration reform, updating the Voting Rights Act, tax reform, expanding background checks for gun owners, or passing ENDA. There's more than enough for us to tackle that translates into jobs. And the vast majority of these policies, if passed in a bipartisan fashion, as the government shutdown was avoided by a bipartisan vote with unanimous vote from the Democrats, with a minority of votes from the Republicans, we could get things done if we would allow for votes to be taken up on this floor. A simple up or down vote, but get it done and grow jobs. This week we solemnly observed the 50th anniversary of the death of one of the greatest leaders our nation has known in President John F. Kennedy, a man who once said, and I quote, "Never before has man had such capacity to control his own environment, to end thirst and hunger, to conquer poverty and disease, to banish illiteracy and massive human misery. We have the power to make this the best generation of mankind in the history of the world, or to make it the last. To act is both in our power and our duty. We must tackle these problems. I implore this House to take up a jobs agenda. Let's put America to work. With that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Schrader, for 5 minutes.
Rise and accept my remarks, sir.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to acknowledge a significant milestone for the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde community of Oregon. This Friday, November 22, 2013, marks the 30th anniversary of the Grand Ronde Tribe's restoration as a federally recognized tribe. The Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde consist of nearly 30 different historic Indian tribes who lived in western Oregon, southern Washington, and northern California. This Confederation of Tribes was created almost 160 years ago when the federal government forced these tribes onto the Grand Ronde Indian Reservation in order to make room for the expanding settler population. Before the settlers arrived on the West Coast, there were more than 60 tribes living within Oregon's stretch of the Pacific Ocean. These tribes reside in their homelands for over thousands of years. As more and more settlers flowed into the Willamette, Umpqua, and Rogue River valleys, they began to overwhelm the land that had once belonged to the tribes. Conflict ensued. By the 1850s, the United States government, in an effort to end the conflict, opened up the lands for the settlers and initiated treaty-making with the antecedent tribes and bands of the Grand Ronde. The United States and the Kalapuya and Molalla tribes, among others, entered into the Willamette Valley Treaty. With this treaty, the United States seized much of the Willamette Valley, while promising money, supplies, education, health care, and protection to the Indians. As a result of the Willamette Valley Treaty and 6 other treaties ceding about 14 million acres, over 2,000 tribal people were removed from their native homelands and forced to resettle in the Grand Ronde Indian Reservation in the Yamhill Valley. At the same time, the reservation consisted, at that time, the reservation consisted of more than 60,000 acres of land. Before the arrival of the settlers, there were 20,000 native people living in the Willamette Valley. When the tribes were forced into the reservation, as I said, there were 2,000. At the dawn of the 20th century, there were only 392 people listed on the Grand Ronde Reservation census. Many people had died as a consequence of the administrative neglect or had moved away from the reservation to find better opportunities for work in the cities. By 1944, the United States government found itself between a depression and a war. Seeking to cut government spending, they began to terminate their treaty responsibilities to Indian tribes and began the process of ending the United States' relationship with the tribe. In 1954, Congress passed the Western Oregon Indian Termination Act, which unilaterally terminated the treaties the government had entered into in the 1850s. As a result of that act, the Grand Ronde Indian Reservation was closed. By this time, the tribe had been calling the reservation home for over 100 years. Along with losing their homes, people lost their access to health care, education, and other services the federal government promised to provide them in the treaties with the tribes. The federal government reneged on its promise to the tribes of a permanent reservation forever. Although the Grand Ronde people were once again driven from the land, they refused to surrender their cultural identity and traditions. In the 1970s, members of the Grand Ronde Indian Reservation community united to form the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde, fighting for their right to be recognized by the United States federal government. After years of dedication and persistent efforts by tribal members, the United States Congress finally restored its relationship with the tribe on November 22, 1983, passing the Grand Ronde Restoration Act signed by President Ronald Reagan. This act, following nearly 30 years of termination, allowed the tribe to be eligible again for federal housing, health, and education services. It also initiated a process that would lead to the Grand Ronde Reservation Act and the tribe's recovery of almost 10,000 acres of its original reservation. Since restoration, the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde have thrived, becoming one of the most successful and vibrant tribes in the Pacific Northwest. With their own money, they have reacquired parts of their original reservation. The population of the tribe has grown from roughly 1,500 members the year after restoration to almost 5,000 members. Grand Ronde boasts a stable economy and is rooted in timber and tribal gaming. The Spirit Mountain Casino on the Grand Ronde Reservation has been responsible for a significant part of the tribe's income since the mid-1990s. Spirit Mountain is the most successful casino in Oregon and also the largest employer in Polk County, employing more than 1,200 people. The Grand Ronde dedicate 6% of casino profits to its Spirit Mountain Community Fund. The fund, which supports a diverse array of charitable organizations in Oregon, has given more than $60 million to local communities, nonprofit organizations, and Oregon's Indian tribes since 1997. The Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde emerged from over a century of hardship to become a thriving community. There can be no doubt that the people of the Grand Ronde will continue to prosper as they have done in this land for 1,000 years. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Chair will remind all persons in the gallery that they are here as guests of the House, and any manifestation of approval or disapproval of proceedings is a violation of House rules. The Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Crenshaw, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I rise this morning to honor the congressional career of my Chief of Staff, John Ariely. I first met John Ariely about 13 years ago, right after I was first elected to Congress. And I knew after that first meeting, when I saw his keen intellect, I saw his wry sense of humor, his love of Excel spreadsheets, his laser-like focus on policy, and his zany Italian zeal, I knew that that was the combination that I needed to lead my legislative office. They say that the decision to have someone be your chief of staff is one of the most important decisions you'll ever make as a member of Congress, because the chief of staff not only represents your political views, but also represents your personal values. And if there's one decision that I've made that I think would be unanimously agreed upon by my constituents as well as my colleagues, it would be the choice to have John be my chief of staff. He has assembled an outstanding team of individuals. He has led that team of individuals through thick and thin. We've fought and won some very important legislative battles, one of which is a proposal, landmark legislation to change for the good forever the way our nation deals with individuals with disabilities. It's called the ABLE Act, and we haven't crossed the finish line yet, but I'm sure we will, and when we do, it will be in large part because of the moral clarity and the hard work and dedication of John Ariali. Winston Churchill once said that you make a living by what you get, but you make a life by what you give. And John Ariali has given me, he's given this institution, he's given all the individuals who've had a chance to work with him his heart and his soul. He's given his expertise, his wisdom, his vision, his patience. And there's little we can do to repay him for all that other than express to him our extreme gratitude and to wish him well on his next opportunities, his next challenges. And so I would say to John Ariali, as he leaves as chief of my staff, thank you for a job well done. God bless and Godspeed. I yield back.
The chair recognizes a gentlewoman from Ohio, Ms. Kaptur, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, now that the Republican shutdown is over, Congress should be addressing the most pressing issues facing our nation: faster economic growth, putting our people back to work at living wage jobs, balancing the budget, and investing in our future. But so far, there is no Republican budget deal completed to set the frame for all of this, to give confidence to business that they can invest, and to the American people that there's some certainty that Congress has done its job. The first step is completion of a responsible budget resolution for 2014, which starts in just a few weeks. And in fact, the federal fiscal year started October 1st. From that would follow, if we had regular order in this House, 12 appropriation bills constrained within the limits of that important budget. But rather than completing the budget bill, I observed the chairman of the House Budget Committee making political speeches out in Iowa rather than getting the job done here. My message today is get the job done of the Budget Committee. We know that the economy will grow when more people are working, and when that happens, the federal debt goes down. The first chart I have here actually shows that during the Clinton years, when employment went up, we were able to balance the budget. Here we have the terrible recession where unemployment went up, and guess what? The budget deficit increased and our accumulated debt grew at extraordinary proportions. Now, think about what happens to the U.S. debt when unemployment goes up. And during the Bush years, we had over 8.8 million jobs that were eliminated because of the Great Recession. When people don't have a job, they aren't paying taxes. They aren't likely buying a new car or spending money at department stores or other consumer spending that drives employment growth and job creation. It drives investment. Moreover, people who don't have a job are likely relying on government for help, unemployment benefits that are extended, or other parts of the federal safety net, social safety net, such as health insurance, health care. That causes a drawdown in federal spending. So the message to my Republican colleagues is, get the job done. That's the only way you're going to be able to reduce the debt. We cannot balance our budget with the unemployment hovering at over 7% nationally. Though the Obama administration has successfully led 42 months of consecutive job creation compared to the Bush years when we went so much into the hole, we still have not dug ourselves out and replaced all those 8.8 million jobs that were eliminated. That's a lot of jobs. Over 2 million manufacturing jobs alone were eliminated. And if we think about that, we've done a good job month by month. It's not what I would call robust, but it definitely has been steady. But piled on top of this gigantic effort to try to create jobs is a nagging trade deficit. And in my part of America, people know well what job outsourcing is to foreign countries. We have had continuing hemorrhaging of U.S. jobs because of trade agreements like NAFTA, China PNTR, Korea, all in the negative, all in the red, not in the black. We have not had a positive trade balance in this country since 1975, and the numbers show it. They just keep getting worse. Can you find anything made in America anymore? $9 trillion in accumulated trade deficit since 1975. That actually equals half of our long-term debt, because our monthly trade deficit now hovers around, get this, $39 billion more imported goods coming in here than we are able to export. This means more foreign goods, fewer U.S. jobs. Over time, these foreign subsidized products from closed markets replace American-made products and the jobs that go with them. The word outsourcing has become all too familiar. Mr. Speaker, if my Republican colleagues want to tackle the federal debt, then they need to bring a completed budget deal to the floor. It's months, almost a year, too late. We need to tackle the federal debt by growing jobs. Bring economic growth and jobs bills to the floor. And we need to no longer bring trade deals to this floor that result through fast track in the kind of job killing that we've had over the last quarter century. Shouldn't we focus on what the American people have been saying to us year after year after year? It's the economy, it's job creation. This institution ought to be focused laser beam on what the American people are telling us. Why is that so hard to do? I urge my colleagues on the Budget Committee, get back to work. Stop the politicking around the country. Get those committees reaching compromises between the House, between the Senate. Let's get the big frame, and then let's, through regular order, bring up the 12 appropriation bills within those budget restraints so we can eliminate the debt by making this economy grow fully again. Mr. Speaker, I yield back my remaining time.
Gentlemen, pursuant to Clause 12A of Rule 1, the Chair declares the House in recess until noon today. Thank you.
And the House returns at noon Eastern. Members will consider two bills today, one to make it easier for drilling for oil on gas and gas on federal land, and the other expanding the global HIV/AIDS program started under President Bush. Later this week, the House will debate hydraulic fracturing regulation and natural gas pipeline permitting. We'll have live coverage when they come back at noon Eastern here on C-SPAN. In the meantime, we will take you live to the House Energy and Commerce Subcommittee on Oversight. They're holding a hearing today looking at the healthcare.gov website, hearing primarily from Henry Chow, the Deputy Chief of Information.